Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Ravlick. Thank you so much for joining me for this particular podcast. As listeners to this podcast series would know, I've spoken to a range of commentators and advocates for the voice to Parliament, on which Australians will be making a decision later this year uh, at a referendum to amend the Constitution. People may recall that there was a lot of noise about detail in relation to this referendum. And reports that have been lying around on websites or uploaded to websites and sitting there, and not really appreciating the fact that not everyone's going to go for a 200 plus page report to understand what's going on. Now, a very accessible book has now been released by Hardie Grant called The Voice to Parliament Handbook. Um, it does say you've got all the detail you need in there. I've previously spoken with Thomas Mayo, one of the co-authors, but joining me today is someone who I've got the privilege of talking to. I happen to watch him over the years. Kerry O'Brien, former anchor of a range of programs on the ABC 7:30 Report, and he's been involved in Indigenous issues for some time. He'll take us through the book and a few other bits and pieces as well. Kerry, thank you for joining me.
Tom, it's a pleasure.
Now, before we get on to a range of things to do with how governments message policy, particularly around an issue like the voice, um, how did you come to write the book with Thomas Mayo?
Well, I had done a couple of conversations with Thomas on previous books that he'd written, both of them in relation to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and he was a participant in the dialogues, particularly the dialogue at Uluru back in 2017, when they came up with that remarkable statement and offer to the rest of Australia. Thomas So we got to know each other a little bit, and Thomas approached me back in November with the idea of doing this handbook on the basis that there would be, and obviously there are, a lot of people who want to know more about the voice. I think many people, even who are inclined to vote yes, have become a little bit worried or a bit confused about the kind of noise that's been created around it, particularly from the No campaign. And so the whole point of having the handbook is that it lays out what is really a very simple proposition, explains the background to it, and gives the history of previous attempts by Indigenous Australians to actually have a voice that's heard in the Parliament and in the corridors of government when policy is being formulated that would obviously have an effect on Indigenous people. It's not exactly a big ask, and so um, I was quite taken by the idea of helping to do this if it is going to clear up some of the confusion and help people make their decision on how to vote. And I might say, Tom, we make no excuses and no apologies for the fact that we are both very much on the yes side of this referendum. And so, on the one hand, we make clear that we are urging people to vote yes, but at the same time, and I'm speaking for myself now as a journalist of more than 50 years, that it's still a matter of professional pride for me to deal in the facts and to deal with accuracy in trying to answer the most frequently asked questions and to lead people to a better understanding of the history and background of the whole thing.
You've been involved in some sort of initiatives and committees, haven't you, to do with the First Nations, Indigenous Australians, if we can use that term, over the years. What have they been?
Well, I mean, as a journalist, because of the jobs I've had and the kind of privilege I've had to have a sort of ringside seat to history, I suppose. So I've been a working journalist since the 1960s, and my own kind of education process on an Indigenous history that I had pretty much total ignorance about and I'm a reflection of, I think, practically every non-Indigenous Australian of my generation and the generations before, and even younger generations than mine, who were taught nothing on Indigenous history at school, and we were certainly taught nothing about the colonial history when whites arrived and the extent to which um, the settlers went about in a systematic manner to dispossess Indigenous people of their own country, but worse than that, to essentially commit massacres, to drive them off and away from the land that they wanted, uh, and uh, and so it was a rude and very rapid learning curve for me when I went in 1970 as a very young journalist to Alice Springs to cover a very different story. But I was utterly shocked to my core by the raw racism that I saw in that town, and I went back there 5 years later for Four Corners. Still, I think I was about 30, 1975, and reported on an Indigenous woman named Paula Sweet who'd been brutally bashed and died, and the 6 young Indigenous men who had gone to jail, committed for trial for her murder on the basis of their confessions. And thanks to two remarkable men, Jim Downing, Uniting Church minister, and Jeff Eames, who was running the fledgling Indigenous legal service, Central Australian Legal Service at the time. They took up the case. Jim Downing could speak Pitjantjatjara, Jarrah, which was the language of these kids, and they were kids. I think they were sort of 18, 20, thereabouts, but they were kids. And Jim Downing proved to the court beyond any doubt that these kids could not possibly have made the confessions that were purported to have been made in their names. Using he could speak the language, and he basically pulled those confessions to shreds. This was not a remarkable case, you know. There God knows how many Indigenous people in the territory over the years had been railroaded into jails for crimes they hadn't committed. There was just an assumption that some Indigenous people must have committed that murder, so Indigenous people went to jail. And in fact, the chief suspect, as it turned out, the white de facto partner of Paula Sweet, disappeared while these kids were in jail waiting trial. He disappeared and was never heard from again. And as a result of that story and of that case, the Whitlam government announced a royal commission into relations between police and Indigenous people in the Northern Territory. 5 weeks later, Gough Whitlam was sacked, Malcolm Fraser became Prime Minister, and that was the end of the Royal Commission. It never happened. Took another 12 years, and I happened to be the ABC's political editor in Canberra at the time, and I was sitting in the committee room in Old Parliament House where Bob Hawke had a press conference to announce the Royal Commission into black deaths in custody. 12 wasted years. But even that Royal Commission, when it was held, and it took place over several years, they took an enormous amount of evidence. They came up with over 300 recommendations, the end result of which most of those recommendations were never taken up by the states. Some were, some weren't. Different recommendations in different states, and the end result is, of course, we're still getting deaths in custody. Now, I've covered the history of the various Indigenous milestones since then, like Mabo and Wick and the Stolen Generations and so on, and ATSIC, and this is the real story behind why the voice is necessary, and it's this: that even after the long decades when there was absolutely no attempt for politicians and bureaucrats to educate themselves as to what Indigenous people really needed by way of enlightened policy, they just took it on themselves to decide what they would do from their remote, arrogant distance, and the end result was failure. What happened after when Whitlam came in? He was the first to establish and we'll call them all voices, Indigenous voices to Parliament. It was called the NACC, was the acronym, and Whitlam introduced this system. There were 41 Indigenous people who were voted from Indigenous communities around Australia, rural, regional, remote, and the NACC was designed to feed informed advice from Indigenous communities to the government and the Parliament so they could create better policy. But then Gough goes, Fraser comes in, he creates another, he changes that body, it becomes the NAC. Instead of 41 representatives, there are 35, and the election processes have been extremely narrowed, and it becomes a different body again. Then he goes, Hawke comes in, he gets rid of the NAC, he eventually creates ATSIC. ATSIC has its ups and downs, has some great achievements, has some governance issues. Howard comes in. Howard doesn't like ATSIC. He'd voted against it from opposition. He'd called it a black parliament. And he eventually holds a review into ATSIC, and everyone assumes that the review is a prelude to him axing it. But surprise, surprise, the review, which is headed by a former Liberal Attorney General from New South Wales, actually finds that ATSIC should be retained, that it does have intrinsic worth, that it is achieving some good things. It's just, it's drifted somewhat from its regional and rural base. And so that committee recommended that the ATSIC ties to the bush should be strengthened. Howard ignored that recommendation and basically axed ATSIC. And so that's been the story ever since. Governments come, governments go. The voice to Parliament in its various forms changes. It's weakened, it's strengthened. It never gets a chance to actually to grow and mature and evolve and reform and make changes to improve its operations. It's never had that chance. I mean, the Parliament of Australia, 10, 15, 20 years was a total bloody mess. It was chaotic. Prime ministers came and went on a regular basis. The institutions that have underpinned the democracy of this country have taken time to bed in and mature and prove themselves. And that is still the case. But this is the first real opportunity for Australia to enshrine some kind of consistency, some kind of permanency to an Indigenous voice to government and Parliament on policy. And that is the hope, that if it is enshrined in the Constitution, it can't be thrown out. The Parliament will always retain the capacity to make changes to it if they feel it's necessary. But because it has the moral and political force of a yes vote at the referendum, if that's what happens, that gives the voice a kind of a strength that makes it much more difficult for politicians in the future to do what they've done with previous voices in the past.
There's an interesting question that emerges out of what you've said. Because when you have a voice enshrined in the Constitution, you do have the need to have something that listens. And how that listening is done is also a significant question.
Yes.
One of the challenges, I think, Kerry, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you've got a few more miles on the odometer than I have, is that even when there's a good idea in policy, it seems that it's either under-resourced or departments haven't delivered or it's fallen down in priority. So there's a question of accountability, isn't there, of delivery of something, whatever that policy happens to be. The question of delivery. So so the voice is there to advise.
Yes.
But what mechanism do you foresee being adequate enough to ensure accountability, which to me becomes critical when we look at the issue of robo-debt, which is unrelated to the voice, where the accountability comes in?
Well, I think that, I mean, everything sort of, these things all kind of fit into the pieces of the puzzle. Um, the voice, the people who would be chosen from there in whatever model is determined for the voice by the Parliament, whether it's the 25 representatives that is proposed in the Karma Langton report, with backed up by regional and local voices, but the people who would be chosen by their communities to make up that voice to Canberra, not from Canberra, but to Canberra. Um, the people who are chosen will have, in a sense, they'll have two, not masters, but they'll have two processes where they are going to be held to account. One, uh, their strength will only be as good as the advice they give. So their credibility will be judged on the advice they give to the Parliament and to government. And you can then come to, this is before we get to how well policy is actually implemented. And their other judges are the judges back in their communities who are watching to make sure that they are genuinely reflecting the wishes and the wisdoms and the knowledge base of their communities in what they are putting to government and the Parliament. So the people who are on the ground, who are the recipients of the policy, they will soon speak up if what is delivered is not what they've asked for or is not reflecting the advice that is given to the Parliament. And those judgments, I think, given the history that's gone before us and the levels of frustration that have been picked up in the various the 12 Uluru dialogues around Australia, and then the 110 further sets of meetings that were held by the Karma Langton people, and the 10,000 people that were spoken to. I mean, these people are going to be way more engaged in this, and part of the process of advice to Parliament will be about the most effective means of delivery of policy, right? So you will have the quality of the voice being judged by parliamentarians and by bureaucrats and by government. You will have those voice representatives making judgments about how well their advice has been received, whether it's genuinely being implemented or not. You will have processes of checks and balance in the Parliament, and you will have an organic check and balance process back in those communities. And there will be far more scrutiny. I think this will be a much more widely, much better, much more informedly reported process if we see the extraordinary happen and the yes vote is recorded in a majority of states and a majority of people in the nation, and we actually get this up. This actually does get up, and Australia takes this opportunity. I know what you're saying about the checks and balances. The thing is, the Australian Parliament, I think, has we've watched a corrupting of process really over a long period of time, but most particularly, I think, in the last 8 or 9 years, the extent to which things like the processes like the Auditor General, who has at times come out with scathing reports about failures of government, failures of process, and so on, failures of governance, and then eventually the government decides to ignore it or sweep it away as best they can. The media loses interest, it gathers dust, and on we go. I think that the last election has given us hope that the people are demanding better. I think the way Teals were elected into that Parliament, to a degree, was a reflection that the Australian public is absolutely fed up with the failures of delivery of policy for one reason or another, or self-serving policy, or a wrong policy that's been delivered for vested interests rather than for us all. I mean, our democracy's in a bit of a mess at the moment, and that's one of the challenges for the Albanese government. Um, but I think part of the problem is the way the public service has been hollowed out.
Mm.
It's not just one side of politics that's done it, but I thought that when Scott Morrison made that speech to senior public servants after
August
the
2019.
2019, wowee, your job is service delivery. We do the policy. Your job is service delivery. I thought that was just appalling. It was appallingly delivered. The sentiment was awful. The message was terrible. And in a way, it was a statement, and the arrogance of it for that to sort of feel that he could say that, knowing that it would be reported. Um, I thought that was such a low point, but one way or another has been happening with the public sector for a long time, and I thought the hollowing out was evident. For instance, with the Lismore, I live up in the Northern Rivers, and so I saw the Lismore flood process close up. I saw the botched attempts to rescue people. I saw how the local community filled the gap in an extraordinary way, where the resources of government were stretched and ultimately failed. There are so many indications of how the public sector has been hollowed out, and that's another process. I don't know how that gets turned around, um, because the damage that has been done is going to take a long time to undo, and it'll be beyond the reaches of even one well-motivated government to do it. Once an institution like the public sector loses its integrity, it's a hell of a struggle to get it back. And I'm not suggesting that public servants individually have lost their integrity, but I think that there is a level of integrity that is. I think the integrity of the public sector has been weakened over time
I think
through neglect and through deliberate kind of contempt of what the public sector represents and the important
you,
part it plays in the
you,
Australian community.
but there's another point that's critical to this. Is that you can't outsource public sector integrity.
No,
It's got to be built into the system.
yeah,
You can't simply outsource integrity because you're giving it to people who are doing a job
profit.
as consultants, as opposed to people for whom the notion of public service is embedded as their work life.
Yeah, Tom, it seems it's no accident to me that we're seeing governments struggling these days to actually find and implement um, effective policy across so many fronts. I mean, we see these entrenched problems and challenges that governments are failing to address, and they're just growing. I mean, climate change, the existential one, is the really big one. But I mean, there are so many policy challenges on so many fronts. Housing is another big one. I mean, I'm not going to take up your time listing them. I wrote a
I was almost going to mention tax avoidance, but let's
oh
leave that one.
well. Look, if the institutions break down through lack of resources, if the resources become thinner and thinner stretched, I don't know what the morale is like. Broadly speaking, it probably varies a little bit from department, but I just think of the some of the extraordinary talent and the contributions that have been made in the public sector over decades, over many decades, and the bad rap that the public sector gets and how easy it is to knock bureaucrats. I mean, bureaucracy brings its own problems and needs its own processes to sort of to kind of keep itself honest. But nonetheless, I think that we are paying a big price for the ways the weakening of the whole public sector process. The frank and fearless advice to government. That's not always been what it was cracked up to be. I might add. I mean, it's a very strong human trait sometimes. If you've got a boss, to tell the boss what you think he wants to hear or she wants to hear these days. But
That's probably why I'm not working for anybody else other than myself at the moment. Um, I have a problem. I tend to tell people what they don't like.
well, I don't regard that as a problem. I think people need to be. Maybe we need to be a bit sensible about how we do that. But honesty is not a bad quality, Tom.
Well,
And
um, I think one of the challenges in dealing with um, the voice, the referendum, and cutting through to the community is how a government communicates policy,
Yeah.
and how you effectively do that. Um, yeah, your book does provide people who've got take the initiative to read more and learn more, a basic guideline to what's going on. But how does the government, the Albanese's and the Bernies and the McCarthy's and others in the government effectively sell a policy position in the lead up to the referendum? 'Cause-
Well, it's a tricky one in a way because the way the no campaigners are trying to slant this whole thing, they call it Albanese's referendum. I mean, this is a referendum that was essentially asked for in the most eloquent of ways by one of the most representative processes by Indigenous people around Australia in the Uluru Statement. Um, the parts of the No campaign are to try and paint the voice as a voice from Canberra, when in fact it's a voice to Canberra. So I think it's hard for the government to actually play a um, a high visibility, high energy campaign to get this referendum up. I think that they're probably conscious that the running needs to be made by Indigenous people themselves, and the Yes campaign is pretty much run by Indigenous people, and so for the actual campaign itself, I think um, I think that the government will probably try not to be too strong in the way it goes. Now, I don't. I'm surmising that from what I've seen. I could be wrong, and maybe they've got to step out and do more. I know that there is an enormous support for the voice across so many different um, significant groups in the country. For instance, I'm told that every church denomination has signed up in support of the voice. I'm told that something like 60 plus multicultural organisations have signed up to support the voice. We're seeing sporting bodies start to address the issue. The NRL, Rugby League, have said that they are going to formally support the voice. And I think that there are lots of kind of grassroots groups like that who are doing the same. But right at this moment, I'm not seeing a big yes campaign being run. And it seems to me that the no voice, even though the no campaign is much smaller, much less representative than the yes campaign is, they seem to be getting more media coverage, and therefore potentially they're reaching more people right at this minute than the yes campaign. And I'm a bit puzzled and worried by that.
can can I put a proposition to you on that point? Is that because we tend in the media to report conflict because conflict is colourful?
Oh, look, I think there's an element of that. There's always an element of that. I'm disappointed, I must say, that I don't think that the no campaigners have been called out to quite the extent that I think they should have been for the misinformation, quite deliberate misinformation, for the kind of scare campaign. I absolutely respect everybody's right to participate in a genuine debate on any policy issue, and particularly an important one like this. And I certainly don't look down my nose at people who say, "Look, I'm worried about this, I'm worried about that. My inclination is to vote no," or to ask questions about it, to challenge it. Fine. An informed debate is a good thing. But I have always had contempt for people who try to win their case by either lying or misinforming, or trying to exploit fear, and worse, trying to exploit prejudice. And there are elements of that in this campaign. So It's sad to me because this should not be bipartisan. This should not be polarised in the way it is becoming. Uh, we should, I just wish that we could all embrace at least the spirit of Uluru, at least the spirit of the Uluru Statement, and treat this process with the respect that it deserves. Sadly, the reality, is not matching that. I take heart in the fact that every state government around Australia, including when it was still in power, the New South Wales Liberal government, all came out and signed an agreement in support of the voice,
Mhm.
enshrined in the Constitution. The truth is that up to now, the only serious political resistance to the voice has come from Peter Dutton in a process that split his own party. Um, I mean, when Peter Dutton posed those 15 questions to the government, when he was still endeavouring to give the appearance that he wasn't opposed to the voice, he was just worried. There are not 15 questions to ask about the voice, Tom. It's a really simple proposition. There are not 15 questions to ask about the voice legitimately. There are serious questions to be asked, of course, but what shape will the voice take? Well, that's a matter for the Parliament. That's a matter for the government to put up a proposal to the Parliament, for the Parliament to debate, and then it's the Parliament that will vote on it and determine the voice, not the referendum. So we're not voting on the shape of the voice. We're voting on the principle. But that's not coming through.
I've been talking to Kerry O'Brien, who's been who's seen more things in his life than some of us have through his career in journalism and elsewhere, about the Voice to Parliament Handbook, a new book that he's written with Thomas Mayo, explaining the referendum to people. I've had a look at it, read through it, even read the cartoons by Kathy Wilcox, which you'll enjoy. So go out there and get it. Kerry, where can people keep track of what you're doing now? Given that you're not on telly, uh,
Well,
can
I'm
you?
I'm just I'm just responding to invitations around the country, Tom, and speaking through the media where I can, going to events. The book is out now in the bookshops, and it's designed as a small book. It's designed. I mean, I couldn't fit it into my back pocket, but I could fit it into my inside coat pocket. It's a very easy thing to
Yeah.
cart around with you, and it's not expensive. Um, so buy up copies for members of your family or your circle of friends, uh, and and you know run your own debates, run your own kitchen table conversations. One of the kind of sentiments that we've heard expressed is people saying, "Look, um, I want to support the voice. I want to persuade others to vote for the voice, but I'm worried. I don't want to have arguments. I don't want to get into conflict, and I'm worried that I don't quite understand it well enough when they say these things." So that is exactly what the book is designed for, to give you the confidence, give you a sense that you really do understand it, that it really is the simple proposition that we say it is, and that you don't get bamboozled by irrelevant questions or questions that are designed to distract. But the conversations can be, should be, and need to be respectful. We can have respectful conversations about this thing, and we'll be a better nation for it, I have to say, without trying to sound corny.
Look, Kerry, you've been really generous with your time. I look forward to putting this podcast up and letting people hear what you've had to say. So thank you so much.
Well, Tom, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity and for having the interest in this. Thank you.